I am the one who has to sign the reports, so I am the one who remembers exactly how many people failed before her. 4 royal engineers, 2 physicians brought in from the outer ring, a tutor who quit after 11 days, a grief counselor who lasted 3. All of them summoned to the Sky Palace Windmere to do one thing, which should have been the easiest thing in the world: get my brother's daughter to speak again, and to fly a kite the way she used to before the transport carrying her mother and father broke apart over the Corin Straits. Senna was 7 when it happened. She was 10 when the seamstress came. I am Fleet Admiral Ilarion Voss, and I had raised my niece for 3 years the only way I knew how, which was badly. With duty rosters and formal tutors and the full weight of the Compact's engineering corps thrown at a silence none of it could touch. She did not scream. She did not cry, not that any of us ever saw. She simply stopped. She sat at her window seat above the cloud sea with her mother's old kite folded in her lap. Its spine cracked in the crash, one long paper wing torn clean through, and she would not let anyone take it from her, and she would not let anyone fix it either. Every hand that reached for it, she pulled it back against her chest like they meant to take her mother a second time. We tried anyway. That was the mistake, I think now, though at the time it felt like the only decent thing to do. My best artificer built her a new kite from resonance alloy, self-righting, weatherproofed, guaranteed never to tear again. She looked at it once and put it in a drawer. A court physician tried a soft neural therapy meant to loosen old grief gently. She sat through it like furniture. I had, by the 3rd year, run out of people with degrees. The linen hall sent up a seamstress instead, and that was pure accident. Windmere's mending queue had backed up during a supply crisis, and someone lower down the chain simply handed Margot Thorell a stack of torn training sails and, buried at the bottom of the stack by a clerk who didn't know better, one small broken paper kite. Steward Yavlin caught her carrying it toward the nursery wing and told her plainly to put it back. "That is not linen," he said. "That belongs to the princess, and it is not to be touched by anyone but the princess. Keep to your sails." Margot was a plain woman, 40-some years old, gray already threading her dark hair, hands permanently pricked and calloused from a life of needlework. She had a boy of her own back on the transport ships, 7 years old, whom she saw twice a year on her contract leaves. She told the steward quietly that she only meant to mend it, and that mending was her work same as sails, and she did not think a torn thing minded who held the needle. Yavlin was not moved. He sent her back to the hall. She went. But she also, the next week, asked to see me directly, which almost never happens from someone that far down the roster. I nearly refused her the meeting out of sheer exhaustion. I am glad, now, that I did not. She did not ask me for permission to treat my niece. She asked permission to mend a kite. "I am not a healer, Admiral," she said. "I don't know anything about grief that a book could teach you faster than I could say it. I know thread. I know how a seam holds under wind if you set the stitches right, and how one doesn't if you rush it. That's all I'm offering. If it does nothing, you've lost an hour of a seamstress's time." I had lost 3 years of everyone else's. An hour seemed cheap by comparison. I let her go up. She did not speak to Senna at first. She simply sat on the floor of the window alcove, at a respectful distance, and took out a plain sewing kit, wax thread, a bone needle, a scrap of ribbon for reinforcing the spine, and began working on one of the torn training sails from her own queue, as if she had simply carried her work upstairs because the light was better. She said nothing about the kite in Senna's lap. She did not look at it, or at Senna, more than a passing glance. She did this for 4 days running. On the 5th, she asked, without looking up from her stitching, whether Senna's kite had torn along the spine, or across the sailcloth, because the way you mended each was different, and she was curious which it was, the way anyone might ask an idle question about someone else's broken thing. My niece did not answer, but she turned the kite over in her lap so the tear faced Margot, just slightly, for just a moment, before pulling it back again. It took another 6 days before Senna set it down between them without a word, and let Margot touch the spine. I was told this happened 3 more times, small piece by small piece. A stitch shown, a length of thread threaded through a splinted reed, the ribbon wound and knotted around the weak point in the spine, before I saw any of it myself. What I saw, on the 11th day, was my niece sitting cross-legged on the terrace floor with her mother's kite whole again in her hands, its spine bound tight in plain ribbon, its torn wing closed with stitches so fine they nearly vanished into the paper's grain, and Margot Thorell sitting beside her showing her, patiently, how to wind the flying string so it wouldn't tangle. Senna looked up at me. It was the first time in 3 years she had looked directly at anyone standing in a doorway instead of past them. She said one word. It came out rough, unused, barely above breath. She said it in our old tongue, the word a small child uses for a mother who is not quite her mother but close enough to matter. A word I will not translate here, because some words lose their shape crossing into another language, and this one deserves to keep its shape. She said it looking at Margot. Margot went very still. I saw her hands stop moving on the string. She did not correct the child, and she did not encourage it either. She simply reached over, slow and careful, and helped Senna finish the last of the winding, and said only, "Let's see if she still flies." They walked her out to the terrace's edge together, my niece holding the string and Margot holding nothing at all, just walking close enough that Senna could feel her there. The kite went up on the first try, banking hard against the cloud-sea wind, and Senna laughed, an ordinary, startled, unrehearsed sound I had genuinely forgotten she was capable of making. And I stood in the doorway with 3 years of failed reports in my hands, and felt every one of them turn to paper. I called a council session that same evening, which I almost never do over a matter this small, and told them plainly what I intended. That a linen hall seamstress had done in 11 days what the whole of Windmere's engineering corps and 2 continents worth of physicians had failed to do in 3 years, and that I meant to see her properly honored for it whether the steward approved or not. Yavlin, to his credit, did not argue. He only asked, quietly, whether he ought to apologize to her directly, and I told him that would be between the 2 of them. I offered Margot Thorell a court title. I offered her rooms above the nursery wing, a formal appointment as the princess's companion, release from her mending contract entirely. She turned down all of it, gently, the same plain way she'd turned down the steward. She had a boy of her own waiting on the transport ships, she reminded me, and a contract she meant to see through, and she did not think a woman ought to be given a crown for doing what any decent person would do with a torn kite and a little patience. What she asked for instead was smaller and, I think, harder to grant with any dignity. That she keep her post in the linen hall, and that every week, on her one free afternoon, she be allowed up to the terrace to fly kites with my niece, for as long as both of their contracts allowed it. I granted it before she'd finished asking. It is to this day the only order I have ever signed with something close to relief instead of duty. Senna still calls her by that old word, on the terrace, on Thursdays, when the wind is right. Margot still leaves at the end of the hour and goes back to her sails, unbothered by title or lack of one. I do not know how many more years her contract has left before she goes home for good to the boy waiting for her on the transport ships. I have stopped trying to calculate it. I have learned, finally, 3 years too late, that some mending isn't meant to be permanent to be worth doing. It only has to hold long enough for something broken to fly again.